James Young, convicted in Dublin for passing forged banknotes and sentenced to transportation for 7 years, arrived in New South Wales on the Waterloo on 30th April 1831. When he arrived, his appearance was strangely familiar. It turned out his real name was James Hardy Vaux, and he had been transported to New South Wales twice before. His third transportation made him the most transported criminal ever recorded in New South Wales records.
These are the blunders from down thunder that made Australia great.
Welcome to this episode of Blunders Down Under, laughable lessons from the past, in which we talk about dumb decisions from the past that have helped make Australia great. I'm Josh McGrath.
And I'm John Gibbs, and today we're talking about James Hardy Vaux, the thief and swindler who was unable to change his ways and ended up being transported to Australia 3 times.
So who was James Hardy Vaux?
James Hardy Vaux was born in Surrey, England, in or about 1782. His father was a butler, and his mother was the daughter of a lawyer. At the age of 14, he became an apprentice to a draper, but soon became addicted to gambling on cockfights, often absenting himself from work and stealing small amounts from his employer to fund his gambling habit. After being fired for poor performance, he found employment in London as a clerk. Unable to find a job that he liked, he joined the Navy, but soon deserted and returned to London.
So, how did James descend into the life of crime?
Throughout his time in London, James mixed with pickpockets and criminals, and by the age of 18, he'd become an accomplished thief and conman. One of his scams was to order clothes and other goods on credit and then disappear without making payment. He continued to steal from his employers, and he was arrested in April 1800 for stealing from the clothing business where he was working, although he was acquitted.
What happened at James's first conviction?
In August 1800, James was arrested for stealing a handkerchief, and this time he was convicted. The jury valued the handkerchief at only 11 pence, so that he could avoid a capital sentence, and he was sentenced to transportation for a period of 7 years. He was sent to Sydney in the Minorca, arriving in December 1801.
And what happened when James arrived in Sydney?
James was very fortunate in that New South Wales, as a penal colony, had a shortage of people who were competent at clerical work. As an accomplished conman, he was skilled at ingratiating himself with important people, and he was put to work in various clerical tasks. He worked his way up to become clerk to the magistrates at Parramatta in 1806.
How did James find his way back to England?
Governor King was returning to England in 1807, and as James's 7-year sentence was due to expire during the journey, the governor appointed James as his clerk for the journey, with responsibility for writing the governor's log and teaching his children. On reaching England, James deserted and resumed his career as a swindler and a thief. In 1808, he married Mary Ann Thomas, a woman of ill repute.
How did his criminal career progress in England?
This time round, James aimed for a higher class of swindling. He dressed as a gentleman and pickpocketed other gentlemen to obtain pocketbooks and snuff boxes. He frequented jewellery shops and stole rings, brooches and chains. Finally, he was arrested and tried under the name James Lowe for stealing a brooch and 3 diamond rings from a jeweller. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to transportation for life.
What happened when he arrived back in Sydney?
James arrived back in Sydney in December 1810 on the Indian. Soon after arriving, he was caught receiving stolen property and sentenced to 12 months hard labour. He was sent to Newcastle, where the most dangerous convicts were sent to dig in the coal mines. He was at Newcastle for most of the next 7 years.
How did James spend his spare time in Newcastle?
While at Newcastle, James compiled a dictionary of the flash language used by criminals and convicts for the benefit of the camp commandant. He also wrote an autobiography entitled Memoirs of James Hardy Vaux, and it was also dedicated to the camp commandant at Newcastle. This was the first full-length biography ever written by anyone in Australia, and it gives insights into criminal life in England and convict life in Australia. The two books were published in England in 1819.
What did James do at the end of his time in Newcastle?
James was allowed to return to Sydney in 1818 and found employment as a clerk. He was given a conditional pardon in 1820, one of the conditions being that he never leave New South Wales, and he became a clerk in the Colonial Secretary's office. His employment came to an end in 1826 when, as a convict, he was no longer eligible for a government job, and in 1829 he escaped to Ireland in breach of his conditional pardon.
Well, what happened to James in Ireland?
In Ireland, he again adopted the guise of a gentleman swindler, with his preferred mode of crime now being passing forged banknotes. He was in Ireland for less than a year before being caught and convicted, this time under the assumed name James Young, and sentenced to transportation for 7 years after the bank supported his plea for leniency. On his arrival back in Sydney, his previous life sentence was reinstated and he was sent to Port Macquarie, the prison for the most hardened criminals, for the next 6 years.
Well, after his time at Port Macquarie, where did James go?
James was allowed to return to Sydney in 1837 and obtained employment as a clerk to a wine merchant. In 1839, he was convicted of criminal assault on an 8-year-old girl and sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. He was released in 1841 and thereafter disappeared from the pages of history.
You mentioned earlier that James had a wife. What happened to her?
James appears to have been an unrepentant polygamist. In 1808, in England, he married Mary Ann Thomas. 10 years later, in 1818, while at the Newcastle penal settlement, he married Frances Sharkey, a former Irish convict, presumably while Mary Ann was still alive. Then, 9 years later, in 1827, he married his housekeeper, Eleanor Bateman, another Irish convict, even though Frances was still alive.
Well, what's the moral of this story?
If you're the type of bumbling criminal who keeps getting caught and punished for your crimes, you really need to rethink your career choices.